Stuff that matters. Mind the gap. Common guesses include China, which is spending trillions to clean up transit, power plants, and factories. Or Germany, which has gone all in on renewable energy. But the best answer might be the United Kingdom. China's emissions are still rising, and Germany's are down 23% since 1990. Meanwhile, Britain has driven down its emissions by 43% since 1990, according to provisional data released Thursday. Massachusetts Institute of Technology researcher Scott Berger helpfully turned the data into a graph. So, has the UK simply moved its emissions to China by closing down the Sheffield steel plants and buying imported steel? Not quite. Its overall emissions based on import consumption are down as well. Though it's true that the country's traditional manufacturing sector has taken a hit, as you would know if you've seen the full Monty. Of course, having low carbon emissions in the first place is better than polluting a bunch and making big improvements after the fact. All rich countries have pumped more than their share of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But the Brits have provided a model for maintaining all the modern creature comforts while kicking their carbon habit. How did they do it? Basically, clean energy replaced a lot of coal, industry put a lid on super pollutants, and dumps captured more methane. GRIST 50 researchers have found that climate change is hitting the South especially hard. Luckily, the region is churning out fixers left and right. We interviewed some of them for the GRIST 50 2018, our annual list of the biggest, baddest rising stars in the sustainability game. Miami is slowly sinking into the sea, but Florida native Delaney Reynolds is a teenager with a plan. Her nonprofit, the Sink or Swim Project, shows young people how to push for climate change policy. James Beard-nominated chef Chiti Kumar is whipping up South Asian interpretations of Southern food with local ingredients. She runs her own restaurant in Raleigh, North Carolina, and somehow still finds time to shred the guitar with her band. Nathaniel Smith, nominated to the list by actor Mark Ruffalo, has a bold, new agenda for the South. He's weaving together equity and environmental justice in Atlanta, Georgia. Activist Judith Nieto isn't afraid to stand up to big oil. She takes people on toxic tours of Houston, Texas, showing how the industry has shaped her hometown. Daniel Blackman is advising Georgia politicians, faith leaders, and business leaders on how to build an equitable green economy. Environmental justice champion Mustafa Santiago Ali calls him a ball of focused energy, hungry for more fixes. We got you. Rip aim in 11th grade, I had an inane habit of staying up very late iming my stoner boyfriend and/or stalking boys who are cuter than him on MySpace. As a result, I essentially never woke up on time for school, which, in my defense, started at 7:45 a.m. But I refuse to acknowledge my role in that in any way. I don't understand why this keeps happening, I would moan at every tardiness slip. I understood extremely well why this kept happening. According to a Huffington Post report by Alexander Kaufman, the EPA is taking a very similar approach to its communications on climate change. On Tuesday evening, the agency's Office of Public Affairs sent around an internal set of talking points. To sum up, the EPA is dealing with climate change. But it sure doesn't know why it's happening. Consider some of the OPA provided points. Human activity impacts our changing climate in some manner. The ability to measure with precision the degree and extent of that impact, and what to do about it, are subject to continuing debate and dialogue. While there has been extensive research and a host of published reports on climate change, clear gaps remain, including our understanding of the role of human activity and what we can do about it. Replace human activity with staying up until 1 a.m. on the internet, and changing climate, or climate change, with always being late to school, and my point stands. Small victories. Did you know that rivers get report cards? The Potomac, once a filthy cesspool contaminated by the curses of 1,000 frustrated senators, just earned its highest grade ever from the Maryland-based Potomac Conservancy. It got a B, which parents around the world will assure you is a perfectly good grade. Right on the heels of the newly revived Chesapeake Bay, which is finally flourishing again after a 3-decade cleanup effort, DC's signature waterway could soon be clean enough to swim in. It received 80 in 2011, but since then, better waste treatment measures have been put in place. Runoff from streets has decreased thanks to a fairly new city policy, and some efforts by environment groups to mitigate water pollution from agricultural operations along the river have worked. In order to grade the river, the Conservancy looked at things like returning populations of American shad and bottlenose dolphins, the increasing numbers of breeding bald eagles, and the health of protected forests lining the watershed. Conservationists warn that the river could backslide rapidly if cleanup efforts lag. You know the old adage, if you completely fail to clean the metaphorical swamp, focus on the literal one. Wait. Cloak and Dagger EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt is championing a new policy. The agency can't base new rules on scientific studies unless the raw data behind them is made public. The proposed policy would prevent EPA regulators from using decades of research concerning the health effects of air pollution and pesticides, Lisa Friedman reports for The New York Times. The EPA heralds the policy as a move toward transparency. Sounds nice. But health data is confidential because the thousands of people who participated in these studies did so on the condition that their personal information is kept private. The policy is cloaked in all of these buzzwords, in all of the positive things that we want to be for: science, transparency. Ivan Oransky of Refraction Watch, a watchdog for scientific journals, told The Times. Across the Trump administration, officials have systematically removed mentions of climate change from federal websites and replaced them with green-sounding, but ultimately meaningless, allusions to sustainability and resilience. And this talk of transparency is not the first time the EPA has masked an anti-science move with an inscrutable term that anyone can nod along with. Last year, Pruitt purged expert scientists who receive EPA grants from the agency's advisory boards, citing conflicts of interest. Never mind that the EPA is riddled with conflicts of interest that have little to do with its scientists. Never mind on Friday, U.S. District Judge Brian Morris told government officials they have to take climate change into account as they map out future infrastructure and land use in the Powder River Basin. The mineral-rich area, shared by Wyoming and Montana, produces 40% of America's coal. The case brought before Morris pitted 6 environment groups against the Bureau of Land Management, which had planned to lease 15 million acres of the basin's public land to oil, gas, and coal companies, without taking into account alternatives that could minimize pollution. The BLM had argued that officials could weigh the effects of mining on climate change on a case-by-case basis. That didn't sit well with Morris, who ruled that failing to take means of reducing mining into consideration constituted a violation of the National Environmental Policy Act. Morris said that the BLM should work with environmental groups on future development in the area. According to a press release from the Sierra Club, one of the 6 plaintiffs in the case, the decision is a win for the environment. This ruling is the latest example of courts forcing the federal government to be honest with the American public about how coal, oil, and gas leasing is contributing to the growing impacts of climate change. Last resort, producing artificial snow used to be a desperate move taken by ski areas within striking distance of surfing beaches. Now, the practice is commonplace, even high in the Rocky Mountains and the Alps. As a headline in Powder magazine read last year, like it or not, snowmaking is the future. Utah's Alta ski area has doubled its snowmaking capacity in the last decade. To make sure all those big machines and water pipes don't detract too much from the scenery, they're painted to blend in with the background, according to a dispatch from Wired. At Snowbird, also in Utah, each snow gun has its own weather station, allowing the machines to start, stop, and adjust water flow all on their own. California's Squaw Valley spent $10 million on machines that automatically change their water pressure and amount several times a second. Heavenly Ski Resort, at Lake Tahoe, can cover 3,500 acres with fake snow. All these machines run on electricity, which comes from the still mostly fossil-fueled grid. That means making fake snow increases the rate of the Great Melt, which in turn creates demand for more snow machines. There's a self-perpetuating cycle of job security for these snowbots. Is this the way Skynet becomes self-aware? 0 hour. Thousands of people marched for gun control this past weekend, a movement energized, organized, and realized by America's youth. Now, teenagers are taking on the ticking time bomb that disproportionately affects the world's youngest generations. You know the one. In 2017, high school sophomore Jamie Margolin founded 0 Hour, a youth-led collective that aims to mobilize young voices in the fight against climate change. Since then, 0 Hour has grown into a full-fledged organization raising awareness about the urgency of climate action. The group is planning a march on July 21 in Washington, D.C., building on the Women's March last January and the People's Climate March in 2014. The march is using the hashtag. In the past few years, young people have ushered in a new era of climate action, from climate change lawsuits against the federal government to indigenous-led pipeline protests at Standing Rock. The recent uptick in youth activism has made one thing clear: teenagers aren't afraid to challenge the status quo, and their passion for justice doesn't stop at gun violence. The buck stops here. His administration had hoped to break ground on the wall within the 2,088-acre Santa Ana Wildlife Refuge along the Texas-Mexico border, because where better to begin than on land that's already federally owned? Never mind that the refuge was created to protect over 400 species of migratory birds and endangered species like the ocelot, which scientists have warned could cease to exist in the U.S. if the border wall cuts through southeast Texas. Lawmakers rebuke many of President Trump's attempts to slash budgets for environmental and clean energy programs by passing the massive $1.3 trillion omnibus spending bill. After threatening a veto, Trump narrowly averted another government shutdown on Friday when he reluctantly signed the bill into law. A marsh within the Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge. Highsmith, Booyan Large, Getty Images. The bill sets aside $1.6 billion for construction of the border wall. Environmentalists and immigrants' rights advocates say that the revised route, which would run along the edge of the refuge, still poses significant threats to surrounding ecosystems and communities. While it preserves the Santa Ana Wildlife Refuge for the time being, it still risks people in places nearby, the Sierra Club's Scott Nichols said in a statement, adding that the wall could increase flooding on Native American land, harm endangered species, and disrupt wildlife migration.